Grace and peace, friends of American Reformed Church. Welcome into worship, the sanctuary this morning as we gather together. This is actually a pre-recorded interview with Jared Kaltwasser. We wanted to share a little bit about our journey over the last few months as we've reshaped and re-envisioned ministry together. And so we've invited Jared here to ask us a little bit about that journey so that we may share it with you. As we begin this morning, we'd like to remind ourselves as a congregation where we began with our recent sermon series. I think we've shared with you before that sometimes our sermon series, even though we've planned them, change based on context and events. And the current sermon series that we are in is one that changed. It came to be after we saw how our community and our area was impacted by the pandemic. And so we want to invite you again to remember the words that we started this series with from Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 through 9. Hear the word of the Lord. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. Keep these words that I am commanding you today in your heart. Recite them to your children. Talk about them when you are at home and when you are away, when you lie down and when you rise up. Bind them as a sign on your hand. Fix them as an emblem on your forehead. Write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. We began this series with those words because we are spending a lot more time at home. And although things of the church have changed and the way that we gather as the church is different, there are opportunities within our homes, within the sleeping and the waking and the eating and the going in and out of our doors into our homes and the community in which we have to see and experience God. So these words remind us of that opportunity, as well as the sermon series that we've currently been in.
This morning we have asked ARC member Jared Kaltwasser to spend a few moments with us, asking us some questions. Jared is a deacon-elect here at American Reformed Church. He also serves as a 7th and 8th grade middle school teacher at South Middle School in Harrisburg, South Dakota. This is his 4th year teaching, his 3rd year in South Dakota. He taught for 1 year in New Jersey. And he has 12 years of experience as a journalist in New Jersey and also freelancing throughout the country. We asked Jared to do this because sometimes as pastors, we do our best to communicate the information that we think the congregation needs to know. But we wanted a congregational member to take an opportunity to ask the questions that maybe are on Jared's heart and mind and to share those with us this morning. So we look forward to this time, and we welcome Jared. Thanks for being with us today.
Thank you for asking me. Maybe just to start out and get into it, we're now in kind of this interesting period where we haven't met together for several weeks, and the regulations are shifting and changing, but we're still not meeting together. Can you kind of give an update on where we're at and what some of the factors are you're thinking about as we venture forward?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that as we've listened to the wisdom and the recommendations of those in the scientific and medical community, and also, of course, we heard on April 16, I think, from the White House that the recommendation for opening things up and moving about freely with one another in community would be a 2-week or 14-day decline of infection rates. And of course, in our area, we have not seen that. We've only seen recently an increase of infection rate. And so we're paying careful attention to that particular recommendation that was given, and as well as recommendations around the number of people who can gather safely, scientific evidence about what it looks like to be in space with each other and to breathe the same air as one another and how that increases infection rate. And so we take all of that evidence that's been given, and we also wrap that into our values as a church: grace, acceptance, wisdom, and love. And we try to make the decisions, and we will going forward as well, that best encapsulate those values along with the evidence that we have.
As we've gone on, even though we haven't been here physically in the church, I know the ministries of the church have continued, but for us members, we don't always see that. We see the live stream when we come in and maybe individual activities. So I thought it might just be helpful if you kind of walked us through what do the ministries look like? What does your week look like as you go through in this socially distanced church life?
Yeah, I think one of the key kind of cornerstone pieces for us as a staff has been to meet on a regular basis. So we typically have our staff meetings on Mondays around 2 o'clock and have an opportunity to gather with Rosalind DeCoster as Director of Youth Ministries and Lizzie Rice as Director of Children's and Family Ministries, Rusty Marinkovich as Facilities Coordinator, and then Carrie Truesdale as Communications and Office Coordinator. And we spend kind of time working through troubleshooting kinds of issues that might have come up during the week, and then really planning, seeking to think about our plan for the week, what needs to be done. There is so much more time devoted now to doing proactive communication. And we've chosen, for the most part, to do communication, written communication that's either sent out by email or on Facebook. And so kind of the way the staff configures ministry is really designed to reach the most people in their particular ministry area as possible. As pastors, we're generalists, so we're trying to reach the entire congregation. And then, obviously Rosalind and Lizzie are trying to reach their particular target demographics as well. I'm thinking about online kind of, discipleship opportunities, online youth group, those kinds of things. And then, of course, we've done the online adult discipleship group and the online prayer group, and trying to find ways to integrate and to find ways to connect with as many people as possible.
And that's really been a value. We have the 4 values of our congregation, but we've adopted as a staff during this time the 5th one of connection. And we kind of went into mode of how do we connect people. And we have various opportunities, pen pals, email pals, the ARC Connect that goes out every week in order to help people think of ways to reach out and connect on their own. And we're seeing some good fruit from that. I was on the phone last weekend with someone who said, I know that this is a really difficult time and there's lots of hardship for people, but for our congregation, I'm seeing us connect in ways we never would have before. And so that is a beautiful thing to see people live into some of the things that we've been trying to implement and really reach out to those that they don't get to see on Sunday anymore.
Kind of related to that, we've still experienced church life, but it's been a different and in some ways kind of like a stripped down version of church. We're still meeting together, but not physically together. We're still doing a lot of the routines. And sometimes that process of stripping something down can help you kind of understand and clarify what's essential, what's core, most important. So how is this process of still being pastor, still having church, but in this kind of stripped down environment, has that changed how you think about what's core and what's essential to church life or the role of church in our lives?
Yeah, that's interesting. I think for me, I cannot put words to it yet, but I do think that there are a lot of changes that are happening in how the community at ARC, but just church communities in general, are going to form identity around this shift that's been happening. And I think that one of the things that we have as an advantage is that we are a smaller congregation than some in our community, which allows us to find more ways to connect intentionally outside of the gathering of worship. I think, Jared, where I'm most curious about is how we will continue if this is a long-term, if there are long-term shifts in how we have to gather and be community, in the ways in which we will start to structure and shape ministry differently. And I don't have words to describe or define an exact answer to that question yet, because I feel like 2 months, although we're well into it and we've learned and we've adapted, I don't think it's given me a good pulse on how that will continue to shape who we are as a community.
Yeah, and I think, Jared, I think that we've learned the distinction between doing ministry with excellence and doing ministry to perfection, and even allowing ourselves to really do the best we can. So the first Sunday, right, we're doing worship on Facebook Live with an iPad. And the second Sunday, we thought that we had things ready to go with our AV system, and it didn't work. And so in the midst of that, you're learning on the fly, you're adapting. And I think initially for me, there was great frustration that things weren't seamless and they weren't put together as well as maybe what we'd like them to be. And the congregation has been incredibly gracious and generous through that. And I think what that would tell me is that there's a value of authenticity in our congregation, and we want to be genuine about who we are, and we want to strive for excellence. We want to do this as well as we can, simply because we believe excellence is a value that God honors. But there's a difference between excellence and perfection. It's not airbrushed. On Sunday mornings, we still misspeak. We still say things that we can't go back and correct. And yet, I think there's a sense of the community coming together in that moment that is really significant for us as well.
It's really profound, as I think everyone knows that we're alternating preaching each week, and whoever is into preaching is in the back helping with tech stuff. And as you get to, if you're not the preacher and you get to see people show up and say, "Hi, I'm here," and then see people respond to that, there's something really beautiful about that. What we do know is that when we come back here, there is going to be a physical distance that may feel awkward. And right now, I think people are really relishing in the opportunity to just see one another show up online, which I think is really neat. It's pretty cool to watch that.
I like it when the kids get control of the
Yes.
like button. And that's good. Mike, a couple weeks ago, you talked about Sabbath, and just the idea of Sabbath as a break, but also like a reflection point, also like enough point, right? Recognizing what's enough. And I think, we think about that in an individual level and maybe in a family level. What is that? How does that idea translate to a church level? Because in some ways, I feel like this has felt like a Sabbath in a way for a church. Do you agree with that? And how does that translate?
Yeah, I think that's true, Jared. I think about it in terms of ministries that have either had to take a break or have had to shift the way that they do ministry. So for instance, how do you gather as a church board, as a consistory, in the midst of spatial distancing? So we've been doing that on Zoom, but it's a very stripped down consistory meeting. We typically are reading a book together. Well, we don't really discuss the book over Zoom. It'd be very awkward. And the discussion that happens in consistory Zoom meetings just by nature is awkward and maybe much briefer than it would be in person. So I think there is a sense in which, yes, there are Sabbaths happening for some of our ministry teams. If you think about the key practices, welcome, worship, know, serve, and share, those teams haven't been able to gather and meet and plan for ministry. And I think that for a season, that can be a very good thing and a very healthy thing. I think we're also recognizing that there's a significant gap, and that we are incarnational human beings. We are embodied creatures, and not being able to kind of experience that interpersonal connection and relationship, I think is wearing on all of us. I think it's wearing on the congregation. I think it's wearing on ministries. I think it's very difficult for Rosalind and Lizzie. And for all of us, just how do you do ministry in this kind of season?
Yeah, I would say also, I think it feels like a Sabbath for the community, but it has not felt like a Sabbath for us. We've spent most of this time scrambling and trying to figure out how to pastor and minister and care for and connect with people, and I think that our activity level has risen in lots of ways. And so there's kind of that awareness too, that there's more legwork involved on our end, which in a lot of ways is really fruitful because there's more interpersonal, individual connections we're making, but it's also not sustainable long term. And so how do we move forward? If there are things we need to change and adapt, our activity level will have to be one of those as we figure out how we pastor anew in this period of time. I think that's a unique challenge that all pastors and church staff are all kind of adapting to and figuring out as well.
If Sabbath is meant to be one day out of 7, a prolonged Sabbath, an extended Sabbath, I think can be destructive also. And I think that I see that happening just in thinking about worship planning. So every week we're putting together an at-home liturgy. And I just said to Elizabeth this week, I said, I was putting that together for Sunday, and it just killed me how much time it took, because you're looking for the right YouTube video for this, and there's no limitation, right? Because it feels like an eternal Sabbath. And so I've got all the time in the world. I should have all the time in the world to pick the best YouTube videos. And so then you're like, well, I don't like how they sing this. I don't like this lyric that they use. And I don't like the way that this is done or that is done. And so there's something to be said about Sabbath is good. And while God gave us the gift of Sabbath, it's one day out of 7. It's not meant to be, all the days, I think is what I would say.
And not to belabor this point, but I also think there's something interesting about, like if you compare this to, we've talked about this a little bit in consistory, if you compare this to winter, like if there's one Sunday that church is canceled because of a blizzard, that's one Sunday, and you back up the next week, and everything resumes. And we are not in the midst of blizzard. And this is a long-term shift that we have to figure out eventually how we're going to live in a new normal. So like for instance, the very first Sunday that we canceled worship, our new members, or our kind of Discover American group was supposed to start. Well, we couldn't, obviously, and we kind of put that on hold, like, well, someday we'll start that again. And then we realized we don't know when that will be. Yeah. And so we did attempt to, we did it over Zoom, and it just wasn't what we would hope for that experience to be. But each person showed up on Zoom video, each person contributed and talked and made the best of it. And so to live into that new reality, to come out of this extended Sabbath and to figure out how we live anew, that is going to be a particular challenge, I think, for all of us.
I was thinking on the drive over here just about the process of entering the church. And in our kind of specific situation, we had this many months when it would be a random door you went in, or you had to park somewhere different. The experience was actually different. And then the whole renovation project, the main result, or one of the main results, is a new experience of walking into the church. And Elizabeth, you talked in your sermon about mezuzah, right? And this idea of like this reminder of, as you enter in, this reminder. And I think as members of the church, there's something that happens when you walk into church on Sunday or on a different day that sort of helps you get in that sort of mind frame or a worshipful mindset. But we don't have that experience. We haven't had that experience for weeks now. How do you, in your own lives, and how should we try to keep those little reminders at a time when we're not actually having that experience of physically coming in to this church setting, at least?
Yeah, I think that's why we tried to frame this sermon series around sort of that little phrase that everything has sacred possibilities everywhere as holy opportunities, to remind us that really our faith gets lived out everywhere, and that is how it is all the time. And this is I think this is a very specific reminder of that when we can't enter into the building of the church and we can't gather with the community, how is our faith and the way that we live out impacted? Of course there's impact. Because I do think that community nourishes us, that worship nourishes us, that giving praise and glory to God centers us in a way that reminds us that this is not all about us. But apart from that, we are still called to live out our faith in the world. And so the doorpost, sort of that sacred rhythm of Jewish practice, is so beautiful to me, because how many times do you enter and exit a door, whether it's a church building or your home or some other place, multiple times a day? And so in that practice, every time you enter or go through a door, you're reminded that in this space, wherever I am going, in this space, I am carrying God with me. And how do I live that out in this space? That's a unique reminder we have now in our homes, and I think this series is designed to help us hold on to some of the good in the midst of this very difficult situation. And this last week, talking about food, I find gathering food, like going to the store, I find thinking about what to eat and preparing it and sort of a like joyless process for me. I'm not one of those foodies who just loves everything about food. And so now I'm faced with the fact that my meal output has tripled when we're at home so much. And so I had to really kind of come to terms with and open myself up to what it looks like to be spiritually pruned in the midst of that process. And this series has really helped me with that, because I'm thinking about that so much more intentionally and really giving that over to God in a way as I'm cutting and making things and thinking about what to make. The blessing is to be able to have food, to be nourished by food, that these blessings came from God. So really now the whole food process for me is a spiritual discipline rather than a joyless labor. And I would not have had that opportunity to grow into that without this experience. So as hard as it is to try to continue to see and experience and acknowledge how God is showing up and shaping us is an important part of this journey.
Let me add a question in, because you had me thinking a little bit about, you said, in every place that you're at, trying to find ways to think about it and think about how you can serve God there. And as you were saying that, I was kind of thinking like, but it's weird now because we're in the same rooms all the time, the same people all the time. And that got me thinking then about, as a teacher, because one of the things that's really frustrating to me is just in a class setting, if a kid is having a hard time or something's going on at home, I'm pretty good at like noticing, in their eye or something, that something's wrong, that they need to talk to me about that. In this environment, that's almost impossible to do, because insofar as I meet with them, it's over computer if they even come to the meetings. Can you talk about, as pastors, how do you, when you don't have that ability to notice those sort of nonverbal things, when people might not be proactively in touch, how do you find out the needs, and how should we help you in that process of the community?
Yeah. I think this is where I really want to name my own limitations in that, and to come into contact with limitations. Do we trust that the Spirit of God is hovering over the chaos of the situation? Do we trust that the Spirit is ministering to those in our congregation when maybe we can't be participating with the Spirit in that ministry in the way that we would like to? I think that we've had some folks reach out to us that maybe have less sort of hesitation or reticence about contacting the pastors and saying, I'm really struggling, or I lost my job, or I'm underemployed, I'm not working as many hours, I've been furloughed, those kinds of things. And it's a tremendous gift and privilege, and we know that there are probably others that we don't know about. And so we trust that God's Spirit is ministering to them, and that as we hear of needs, it's kind of this fine balance, because you don't want to be invasive on a person's life, but just to kind of continue to make ourselves open, to model that, I think, in the way that we show up on camera on Sunday mornings, that we're broken with them and that we love them, and we trust that maybe God's Spirit's doing work that we can't even do or participate in right now.
But apart from that, there's also intentional work that is being done. So notes went out to everyone in the congregation with, some of them there were reminders of like, please, if something comes up, if you need something, don't hesitate to call us or email, and then a card for ability to contact easily. Phone calls were made to people specifically that we were wondering about how they were doing and if they were in need of something. So those phone calls led to great conversations and vulnerability from some. And then elders and deacons were also asked to reach out, because we're only 2 people, so they made contact in various ways: phone calls, emails, letters, making sure that people knew that they too were available to be contacted, that we have an errand and delivery ministry. That was part of the goal in contacting people, to remind them that we're here and that we're praying and that we want to, although we can't physically visit with them whenever we can. And so they'll be circling around again to do that. And I think those intentional efforts at trying to just maintain openness and let people know to reach out are very important, because we can tend to be guarded. And now that we're in our homes all the time, it's much easier to guard ourselves and not express the vulnerability and need. So we're thankful for the efforts, not just ours, but the people surrounding us in leadership who have also made effort to do that.
I mean, kind of as a last question, we've talked about a lot of the challenges of this experience. I think one of the neat things, or a couple of the neat things, are like, for one thing, people who maybe live out of the area or shut-ins who can't normally come here are able to participate in the same way as everybody else and live. So in some ways, they're more directly able to be on the same level, I guess, as all of us. I also think just there's been needs maybe that have been exposed that we didn't necessarily know, and now we do. And so there's some ways in which sort of the walls of the church, the sort of negative walls of the church, have been taken down. What's something that is there anything you've learned from this positively that you want to try to make sure we continue doing or keep doing once we go back to something more regular?
Yeah, I think we are not committing to what that will look like, but awareness that there is something barrier breaking about having that Facebook Live access on Sunday morning. And I'm not sure what that will look like. That will be experiments that we'll have to do when we're gathering together again. But we also realize when we gather together again, I'm guessing that there will still be guidelines in place and recommendations for people who are at risk to stay home. And so we want to make sure that that experience is still available for those people who need to maintain some even safer, larger distance than spread out in a sanctuary. So yeah, I think we're still kind of working through, like, what will this look like? How will we continue this? And those are all good conversations that we have yet to solidify. And I think even once we start it, and this is the perfect congregation to do it because everybody's so gracious, but it'll be evolving. We'll be learning, like, oh yeah, no, that didn't work that Sunday, so let's do it this way next Sunday. And we'll have to keep trying until we figure out what that rhythm looks like. Because as someone asked me, why did you move everything askew on the stage? And to try to clue people into, like, well, there's nobody here, and the camera is affixed on a wall and only looks really one direction. And so if we want to look at the camera and talk to the people who are there, we have to move everything and shift it all this way. Well, when we have people back in the sanctuary, that all changes, and so we shift back, I guess. But then we still have a good section of audience who are live with us. The camera is askew. So there's just these little tiny things that we don't always think about that will play into how do we move forward to balance both an online presence and an in-person presence in the next wave of new reality that we enter into. I think that'll be a challenge, but it's going to be fun to experiment and figure out how to do it. So,
yeah, I think so. We had a sense that one of the greatest community needs in our region is this need that many social psychologists have identified as social isolation, and this loneliness kind of epidemic. And so what I think we have discovered is that the church can be, I know that this is a day and age where the church doesn't always get a lot of credit, but the church can be a place where we are looking out for the least of those in our community. And I see it happening among the members of American Reformed Church in the way that they're looking out for their neighbors in ways that are safe and wise and smart. But I think I would hope that our commitment to continuing to make sure that the pace of our lives is not so rushed that we're not paying attention to those who are on the margins will be really essential and important. I just want to acknowledge, too, that I think we are all yearning to get back, to return to something. And the image that just keeps coming to me is the image of the Israelites returning to Jerusalem after the exile, and how difficult that was for them. And so I think trying to figure out how do we continue to support each other when we come back to worship and maybe we are scattered and we can't shake hands and we can't hug. We might not even be able to sing safely. what does it look like to support a community that's in the midst of a lot of grief and a lot of sorrow? I think I'm wondering how we do that. I think we find it easier to do that when the social isolation can be identified because nobody's allowed to come here. But what does it look like when we're still experiencing some isolation when we have to return?
We do have a sense that when we gather back here, it is going to feel much less like we've envisioned it, because we are envisioning, I think, coming back like it was on March 8th. And it won't be March 8th. And so there are going to be new expectations and guidelines for how we gather, and it's going to feel different. And I think we just need to prepare people for that it's not going to be the same. And that doesn't mean that it can't be good and that we can't gather and we can't worship, but it will not be the same. And so for right now, we're really thankful for the community that's building online, and we're just grateful for people that show up every Sunday and support one another by just saying, like, I'm here, hello, and grace and peace to you, and kind of chat back and forth in preparation for the reality that even when we come back here, it's just going to feel different. And we're all going to kind of have, as I look out here, we still have the pictures on the pews of people's faces that were printed and put up there. It will be wonderful to see all these faces in person, but it will not be hugs and handshakes and standing close to one another and joyful singing. It will be something different. And how do we prepare ourselves for that and still appreciate the experience of one another? That's going to be a good challenge for us.
Thank you both for your willingness, your leadership, and also your willingness to talk through and think through these vulnerable questions.
Thank you, Jared.
Thanks, Jared. Yeah. And thank you, dear friends of American Reformed Church, for joining us this morning. We trust and pray that whether you're joining us on the Facebook live stream or whether you watch later on local cable access television or the church's webpage or the church's YouTube channel, we trust and pray that you would have a strong sense of belonging and connection to this faith community. Know that we're praying for you. We miss you. We love you. And may God's grace and peace go with you all. Thanks for joining us.